Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. So this first panel is meant to be kind of more of an overview about what's happening to Earth, kind of in a broad global sense. There are some panels later where we'll go into some more specific details on some speakers, about energy and oceans and climate. And Monica Skeldon, our new executive director, who I'm very happy to have with us today, is going to moderate this panel. She just started with us about a month ago as our part-time executive director on a volunteer basis. And so far, I think I can say for all of us that she's been really great. And I'll let you hear her prove it for herself right now.
Thank you, Martha. That was a lot of pressure for my first public appearance as executive director. But first, I missed the introductions this morning, so I'd just like to say thank you all for coming out and for supporting our task. It's great to see such a great turnout in response to this conference. So just I'll quickly do an introduction, and then I'll lay out some of the ground rules of how I'd like this panel to run, and then I will turn it over to the panelists. So I come to our task with 4 years of experience doing environmental sustainability consulting for large multinational corporations. So a little bit different background, but I think some of the lessons that I've learned through consulting are very valuable to instill in different organizations, especially small nonprofits. So I'm looking forward to working with everyone in this room to put in place a great strategy moving forward for our task, to continue hopefully holding this conference every year in addition to providing other outlets for education and opportunities for the youth to share their voice on climate change and other leading matters. So with that, I will get into the panel. So today's panel, as Martha said, is focused on the broader issues of what's happening to Earth. And so I've asked all of the panelists to provide an introduction to themselves via this question and how they are approaching this question based on their backgrounds. So I encourage you after they introduce themselves and I provide a few additional questions to them, to stand up when you have a question. Just raise your hand. We'll have someone coming around with a mic, but I really want this to be interactive. The panelists are here to answer your questions and give you a better understanding of what's happening, so please feel free to ask questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Benjamin DeAngelo? DeAngelo?
Should I get up?
Yeah, if you want to come up.
I should get up here so that everyone can actually see me. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you on this Saturday morning. And thanks to our task for inviting me here. So it's the first time I've attended this conference. Again, my name is Ben DeAngelo. I work at EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in D.C. I've actually been with EPA for 16 years now, and for most of that time I've worked on the climate change issue, and because I've been at EPA for that amount of time, it means that I've worked under different administrations. So when I first worked at EPA, it was under the Clinton administration, and then it was the Bush administration, and now the Obama administration. So I've also seen, some of the changes that take place also on the political landscape and how it affects our work. My primary role at EPA is as an analyst and as an advisor. My academic background is a mix of earth science, climate science, and environmental policy. I studied geography, actually. I finished my undergrad in the early 90s. At that time, climate change was being discussed, not as much as it is now, but it was really starting to take off in the early 90s. There was the 1992, the signing of the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that international framework has already been around for quite a while. The gist of my job, I guess you would say, is that I'm very much a go-between and a bridge between the scientific community and the policy community. So I'm not practicing science per se, so I'm not up in the Arctic collecting snow samples. There are many days when I wish I were doing that. But my job is my job is basically to stay on top of the science, try to understand the science, and translate it for our non-technical policy people and managers and policymakers, and also incorporate that science into our policy analysis. And I can give some examples of that later. In terms of the question, what is happening to Earth? Because of my job, obviously, I can give just a few points on climate change. For the most part, you've already heard a lot of some of the key, I would say, overarching scientific pillars of climate change from the earlier talks. But let me just try to summarize really quickly. Number one, greenhouse gas emissions. We emit a lot of them. Greenhouse gas emissions, once emitted, stay in the atmosphere for a long time, decades to literally centuries. As a result, greenhouse gases have been building up in the atmosphere, and we have clear evidence of this. You heard earlier, we're at about 400 parts per million. That's about a 40% on CO2. That's about a 40% increase since pre-industrial times. And those levels of greenhouse gases are projected to continue climbing for the foreseeable future. Because greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere, we're seeing other changes in climate. We are seeing observed changes in global average temperature, regional temperature. There are records of sea level rise, shrinking glaciers, shrinking Arctic sea ice, also ocean acidification. So there are numerous signs pointing to human-induced climate change, and we can now say with a lot of confidence that what we're observing now can indeed be attributed to the human-induced buildup of greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of future risks and consequences, we don't have all the answers, and of course there is a lot of uncertainty about exactly what will happen, when, and especially when you look at local, regional scales, what's going to happen to my city, my community. Those are difficult questions to answer when projecting out into the future. But we're undertaking a lot of things at EPA to address greenhouse gas emissions, and I could give some examples and stories of those when we get into Q&A, but maybe I will just leave it at that for now.
So next we have Thomas Lovejoy, who's a professor at George Mason and is the Chief Biodiversity Advisor for the UN Foundation.
Super. So, first of all, I think you need to know a little bit about Jerry Barney, who's been his usual modest self. So Jerry was in charge for the Carter administration and the Council of Environmental Quality in a very famous publication called the Global 2000 Report to the President, looking at all these issues that now we revisit today. And he sought me out to do a piece on endangered species, which I thought about, and I went back to him and I said, Jerry, I think the problem is bigger than endangered species in a section and wildlife in a section on forests. And he said, okay, go with it. And that became the first projection of global extinctions, published in 1980. And Jerry came to me about 4 years ago, and he said, we have failed. We laid out all those issues, and they've only gotten bigger. And we really need to engage the next generation in addressing all of this and waking up us older folks to do more than we're doing. And so that was the origin of our task. And thank you so much, Jerry. It's great to see this organization getting the traction it really deserves. So I just had a great biology teacher when I was 14 years old who in 3 weeks flipped my switch. And he taught a course that started with blue-green algae and ended with mammals. And so before I was 15, I understood the outline of life on Earth and found it so astounding and fascinating that I've never been able to get enough of it since. I didn't know I was going to be a scientist, and I live on a world on the interface between science and public policy, do a lot of work in the Amazon, and in the end, look at everything we're talking about through biological glasses. And that's a very important way to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it. The social lens is really important, so are the physical sciences. But in the end, this is a living planet, and that's what supports us. And so when Johan Rockström produced this diagram in 2009 with his colleagues called Planetary Boundaries, it was, I think, one of the best ways to sort of portray the total challenge that we face. And basically what he means by planetary boundaries is large global characteristics or cycles that have departed from the levels in the previous 10,000 years, which essentially nurtured the origin of human civilization. And so there are a lot of them for which there are insufficient data. We already heard a lot of the symptoms that people can observe visually or by taking temperature. But the whole notion here is that anything that goes beyond the central green zone, which is the conditions that nurtured the rise of civilization, is probably something we should be addressing quite strongly. And so you see on the right-hand side the nitrogen cycle, and I think they have that just about right, because there's twice the level of twice the natural levels of biologically active nitrogen available in the planet, and that leads to dead zones and estuaries and coastal waters in the Gulf of Mexico, because it just tilts the balance in those ecosystems, and they become very, very low in oxygen and support very little life. So they got that one just about right. Climate change, and I've had this discussion with Johan, and he agrees with the criticisms that I'm reflecting here, and he's hard at work on Planetary Boundaries 2.0. Climate change is underestimated. And the reason that it's underestimated is because it doesn't reflect sufficiently the implications of climate change for biodiversity. And basically, there's not a place on this planet where you can't see the fingerprints of climate change on natural things. So changes in annual cycles, the birds nesting earlier, migrating earlier, species changing where they occur, and in fact, abrupt changes in ecosystems like bleaching in coral reefs, which is basically caused by relatively brief periods of relatively little increase in temperature causing the fundamental partnership on which coral reefs are built to break down. And the coral animal essentially ejects the alga, and the technicolor world goes black and white. So climate change is underestimated in this diagram, and the rate of biodiversity loss is the biggest excursion beyond the green safe zone, if we can refer to it that way. And that's for a very simple reason, which is there's nothing that's called an environmental problem that doesn't affect biological systems. So biodiversity is integrating all the other kinds of environmental changes that we are driving on this planet. So that's my sort of overall introduction. Later I want to tell you about some good win-wins that the biology of this planet offers us if we choose to take them up, particularly at scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. So next we have Jennie Wetter, perfect, the Director of Public Policy with the Population Institute.
Hi, I'm Jennie Wetter. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Population Institute. My background is I have my undergrad in environmental science, and I got my graduate degree in global environmental policy, focusing on environmental peace building and kind of where environment and development come together. And I find myself in a very lucky position of being able to work on 3 issues that I'm very passionate about, which is environment, development, and women's empowerment, and those all come together by working on population. So a little bit on where we are right now. I think the important thing is to look at people. So right now in the world, there are about 1.2 billion people who are living on less than $1.25 a day. When you look at that a little broader, you'll find out that actually there's an additional 1.2 billion people, so a total of 2.4 billion people who are living on less than $2 a day. So that means there's 2.4 billion people who are just a disaster away from being in extreme poverty. There's also 1 in 8 of people in the world who go to bed hungry. So that's 870 million people in the world who experience chronic hunger. When you get to the women's part, you see that there are 287,000 women who die every year from easily preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. That's 800 women every day, or 2 every minute. So what do all these numbers have to do with population? Right now, there's 7.2 billion people in the world, and the estimates are that it'll get to about 10.9 in 2100. But that's only if fertility rates fall as expected. And oftentimes you hear about by 2050 we're going to have 9 billion people in the world, as if that's a given. It's just that's what it's going to be. But that's not true. If fertility rates don't fall as fast as predicted, or if they fall faster, there could be less, there could be more, and it's all within a margin of if women have half a child less or half a child more. And that leads to a huge challenges. So we always look at population as saying it is a huge threat multiplier. So looking at it practically, if you look at Africa, there are 1.1 billion people who live in Africa right now. By 2050, the population of Africa is expected to be 2.4 billion. Now, what does that mean to all those other problems I just discussed for hunger, for poverty, for maternal mortality? You have countries that are struggling to keep up on these issues right now. And if you're talking about the continent doubling, and some of those countries tripling or quadrupling their population by 2050, how are they going to be able to keep up with these struggles to meet the needs of their people? And then if you add on top of that, a big topic that we've been talking about today is climate change. How is that going to exacerbate all those problems? So, not to be all glum, there are good things. And the good news is we know what needs to be done for population. We know what the answers are. And they're all good things to do. So, making sure that we end the practice of child marriage. Make sure that girls aren't getting married under 18. 1 in 3 girls in the developing world are married before 18. 1 in 3 of those girls are married before 15. And often those girls are expected to begin having children right away, as soon as they get their period. So if they're having children young, they're not able to negotiate with their husbands on how many kids they can have, if they want to have more, if they want to have less. They're just having children by chance. That helps increase population growth. Those girls, when they get married so young, are often pulled out of school. They're not able to complete their schooling. Again, they don't have the power to make any life choices for what kind of size of family they have. And then the most important to that, if they want to be able to have a smaller family size, they need the tools to be able to do that. They need access to family planning services. So right now there's 222 million women in the world who would like to time or space their pregnancies differently, but are not using a modern method of contraception. And we know that to make sure that all those women have access to the services they say they want to have smaller families, because smaller families are healthier families. They're able to invest more in each of their children. The total worldwide is $3.5 billion. That's it. So I think I'm just going to kind of leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later.
And finally, let's welcome Laura Johnston, the grants manager of the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund with Conservation International.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Everybody's been really inspiring already on 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Like the moderator said, my name is Laura Johnston. I work for Conservation International, which some of you may be familiar with. We are one of the big, large international conservation NGOs. We've been around for about 25 years, and anything you can think of that would be in that large umbrella of conservation that would be done around the world, we're trying to do it. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, sometimes hard to prioritize. And our mission is to conserve nature for the benefit of people. That shifted a little bit a couple years ago. We used to be solely biodiversity focused. And I actually work for a program called the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which is all focused on biodiversity conservation. For those of you that are familiar with that, you probably already know what the lingo means. Anybody who doesn't, it just means trying to preserve all the plants, animals, and ecosystems in the world, but that's focused on a few hot spots around the world. There's about 40 of those locations, and we try to invest in a few of them every couple of years. And all those areas are critical because they're the hot spots, because they're pockets and the largest concentrations of biodiversity around the world, but they're also, because they're so full of that richness, they're also usually losing at rapid numbers. What Bob Engelman said this morning, Dr. Lovejoy, you're seeing that biodiversity loss is at levels that we can't even understand. We're losing species at about 100 times faster than we were decades ago. But the purpose of our fund is to give money to community groups around the world, some for-profits as well, that are working to conserve biodiversity. So that could be anything from a group in Southeast Asia working on rhino conservation, or it could be a group in rural Kenya working on agriculture and monitoring biodiversity in their little community to make sure they get more yields from their farmers. It could be a group in Panama working to preserve one species, or a group in the Pacific Islands working to get rid of rats on an island because they're impacting the other biodiversity on that island. So that's what I do every day. I sometimes get to go and see these projects in the field, but most of the time I'm talking to people on the phone, or I'm helping them talk about their proposals in terms of what's good for their communities, how they're going to be able to work with other partners that we're funding. But I'd say it can be daunting when you look at the numbers in terms of what's happening with biodiversity loss, but I am inspired every day by what we're doing, because the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund is the only fund of its kind in this scale around the world, and truly there are people and groups doing more than you think possible trying to save this biodiversity. So that's what I do, and I'm happy to talk about that today. And in terms of the question, what do you see happening in the global environment? I do, for my day-to-day job, I see that biodiversity loss is an issue. More and more, but more people are speaking up and making this known. We're also losing amounts of money around the world that are funding biodiversity conservation, so that is a concern and something that we need more people out there to come and to get excited about and to work in, and to, whether it's on the Hill or working with NGOs or working in academia, we need more people to get excited and to listen and even understand what is this term biodiversity that can be daunting for folks. Another reason I'm here is I continue to study what I did my master's thesis on, which is climate change and American behaviors and opinions and how closely those are aligned. Like many of you, and like Dr. Lovejoy mentioned, I had a eureka moment when I was sitting in a movie theater watching An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. Always had been an environmentalist, and it was in graduate school, and I thought, you know what? Like, am I really putting my money where my mouth is? And got to be more interested in how many Americans are doing that. A reason I like to continue studying that is I think all of you out there, all of us that are quote-unquote already drinking the Kool-Aid, we know what we need to do, but are we always doing it? And then what about the folks that aren't as aware or aren't as active? How can we do what Bob Engelman said and just listen a little bit more and not get so frustrated when somebody doesn't recycle or somebody doesn't take one less trip in their car? What can we do to tell more Americans that more of us are doing something? There's a lot of good things out there happening, but how can we also not get frustrated, and how can we meet other people halfway? So I'm here also on that level because I think something great that's happening both in the United States and around the world is more and more people are interested and they want to do something and they want to talk about climate change, but they're just not quite sure always how to get started or how to move past the choir that they're already speaking to. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you all for the great introductions. So I do have a list of questions prepared to ask the panelists, but before I launch into them, I want to open the floor to all of you. Was there anything that was discussed during these introductions that you want to ask more about? Because this is really for you. So if there's something you want me or you want the panelists to discuss, please raise your hand. And introduce yourself when you before you ask your question. Thank you.
I am Amory Fisher. I'm a Sierra Club intern this year, and I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. I had a question mainly for, Benjamin from the EPA, but also this can go to everyone. With experience working with both types of political parties, do you find the use of terms like earth, environmental, or nature can obscure or hinder talks at all? And if so, what are some phrasing and terms that would be useful in negotiations or talks?
Yeah, you can use that mic or stand up.
Okay. No, just, thanks for the question. So I guess it's, first of all, it's fair to say that climate change is a political issue, no doubt about it. And so, and that's not necessarily the case for all environmental issues that EPA has to deal with. So without question, changes in administrations have changed the course of action that EPA would take. I think as a general matter now, with climate change, given the development and the evolution of the science, there is, it's gotten stronger. And so I've seen the evolution of time. There is more of a comfort level talking about climate change in more definitive terms over time, recognizing that the science has gotten more solid. In terms of your question, words that might help or obscure, I guess, talking about the issue or negotiation. This is this is something I think about too, and it's an issue. And other speakers have kind of touched on this issue of perception, and there's no doubt, and it's unfortunate that global warming has become a buzzword, and it immediately ignites some political reaction, which is the reality, which to me is it's a very, very unfortunate thing that this has happened. So talking about this issue is really a challenge, and I personally find myself talking about it differently depending on who I'm talking to. And I personally don't want it to be a Democratic or a Republican issue, and my hometown in Pennsylvania, it's a fairly conservative place, so when I go back home and talk to people about what I'm doing, I say things a little differently, and my own experience has taught me, and actually I've seen some research on this, is that there are ways to talk about climate change to different audiences, and I think for some folks who might have an immediate negative reaction, like global warming, you're that guy. There are tangible things you can talk about, sometimes without the political baggage of global warming. Tangible things that affect a community. Sea level rise, energy efficiency, getting cars more efficient. You can have these conversations and talk about solutions, whether it's on the emission reduction side or the adaptation side. I think there are ways of having those conversations in a way that breaks through to an audience that would otherwise immediately turn you off. So that might be a kind of some way of answering your question, but.
Yeah, so it's kind of more solution-focused than problem-focused in some of the conversations?
I think that's fair to say. With climate change and a lot of other environmental issues, there are indeed a lot of negative indicators that are depressing. But you want to be careful not to just bash people over the head with a laundry list of doom and gloom, and you don't want to just be the Debbie Downer. Someone said, where there's life, there's always hope, or where there's humans, there's always hope. So I think focusing on the solutions is always a good way of kind of breaking through. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I completely agree that focusing on solutions is got to be just really important in how one talks about all of these things, because otherwise, what are you going to do about it? Could we, by chance, get the projector on? So when I talk about climate change, I start with this guy who, in 1896, wrote the paper that basically established the greenhouse effect. So it's really old science, right? And I explained that actually what he was trying to answer was the question, why is the Earth a habitable temperature for people and other forms of life? Right? Why isn't it too cold? And the answer was the greenhouse effect. And so the greenhouse effect is actually old science. It's what we're adding to it that creates the problem. And I then go on to say that what Arrhenius did not know was anything about the temperature of the Earth for the previous couple 100,000 years, or that little bit in the upper right there, that 10,000-year period of unusual stability in the Earth's climate. And we heard a reference to the past 10,000 years already this morning. So that's the conditions that nurtured the rise of human civilization. That contains all our recorded history, some of our unrecorded history. It includes the origins of agriculture and the origin of human settlements. It basically makes the point that the entire human enterprise is based on the assumption of a stable climate. So that's how I go at it.
Jerry, did you have a question? Oh, okay.
Well, as you may be aware, Citizens Climate Lobby is working on trying to get through a revenue-neutral carbon tax at the national level. And recently they commissioned a report by an organization called REMI that analyzed the economic impact of this kind of tax. So it would be a $10 per ton tax, increasing by $10 a ton each year, which would be distributed equally to, on a per capita basis to households. So that would be revenue neutral, and 2/3 of households would come out ahead or even compared to before. And the study found that it would increase jobs by 2 million in 10 years and almost 3 million in 20 years, and it would decrease carbon emissions by 33% over 10 years and 50% over 20 years compared to 1990 levels. So this gives it gives a policy that has a positive economic impact as well as significantly reducing carbon emissions. So what do you think this kind of adds to the discussion in terms of connecting the economy and the environment in terms of having a policy that can benefit both? Or,
I suppose that question is for me.
yeah, probably.
I actually didn't. The very last part of your question, benefit both.
Well, what do you think of this kind of policy that could? I mean, so usually the arguments against a lot of environmental policies are that they're going to be bad for the economy, but this is a policy that is going to benefit both the economy and the environment. So, do you think this could get some traction?
I think. Well, first of all, I would just say I think we already have a lot of evidence based on and not always climate policies, because greenhouse gas emissions policy is a fairly recent phenomenon in the U.S. But we already have a lot of evidence pointing to both health and environmental benefits and economic benefits over time. There have been many times in EPA's history where we're about to embark on new regulations or policies, and for almost every significant action, there was always a large outcry that doing this would wreck the economy and kill jobs. But the fact is, and the evidence is very clear, is that over the last few decades, we've gotten cleaner in terms of, by and large, we've gotten cleaner in terms of cleaning up, what we'll call traditional air pollutants that affect human health. And at the same time, we've grown the economy, and there are other countries in the world that don't have a strong EPA or don't have strong environmental laws or enforcement, and some of those places they also have the economy isn't thriving as much, and sometimes people aren't as healthy, and you need healthy people to have a healthy economy. So I think we already have a large body of evidence that shows that progressive environmental protection and economic growth can absolutely go hand in hand. On analysis of revenue neutral taxes. So EPA, right now we're not in the business of evaluating carbon taxes. I mean, that would be more of an issue for for Congress and the White House. It's a little above us right now, but we have done economic modeling on our own greenhouse gas reduction proposals and previous legislative proposals, and we have shown that you can have continued economic growth while controlling carbon pollution.
Some of the issue in talking about the effect on the economy tends to ignore the costs created by climate change. And we already heard reference to the 2-degree target that the nations of the world have ostensibly agreed to stop at. Well, the reality is the last time the planet was 2 degrees warmer, the oceans were 4 to 6 meters higher. I mean, I don't think you need to know much more than that to know that we really need to move ahead. And so just about every economist that's looked at this problem, including my classmate Bill Nordhaus, who's considered a fairly conservative economist, says that a carbon tax is the way to go. And then the politics become, what do you do with that money? And is there an opportunity for tax reform here so that we're taxing the bads and not taxing the goods like labor?
I have a short question that I'd like to get out before we run out of time. I've got 2 grandchildren. They're so high. And I have dreamed about taking them someplace where they could experience wilderness, where there has been no change caused by humans. Can you tell me a place on the planet that I could take them, or a place that is relatively immune from human impact?
So there's 2 different questions there. Is there a place untouched by human activity? Probably not, although maybe, the bottom of the Marianas Trench or something like that. But there still are places which are relatively untouched, and I'm famous for taking people to a camp in the middle of the Amazon, and it's pretty much unbroken forest from there all the way to the Guianas, and we have a pair of harpy eagles, the 2nd largest bird of prey in the world, nesting near camp. But something is going on with tree growth in those forests. Something is going on with lianas, vines in those forests. You only pick it up statistically, and if you went there, your grandchildren would have a great rainforest experience, as I must say did President Cabrera, because he was there with his whole family at the end of the year.
I wanted to add something to that in terms of this sentiment that's been going around today about trying to be a conscious person and trying to be reflective in this discussion. I think all of us are probably in the room because you had some moment in nature early on, and then you had another, and then you had another, and you had another. And somebody brought you there, and something was a spark that went off for you. And every time it happens thereafter, it becomes that much more special. I saw a film a couple weeks ago called Damnation. It's about dams all over the country. Some of you have seen it. If you haven't, there's a plug for it. See it. It's excellent. You learn everything you want to know about damnation or dams in America and around the world, why they're really not good, and historically why we built so many in the United States. It's sponsored by the company Patagonia, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But in that film, something that they say is, if you don't have a river that you have a relationship, there's really no way that you can care about it. And that resonated with me, and I think the question that was just asked is really important because all of us in here are going to continue to go out and seek moments in nature, and because they fulfill us and because they either drive us to want to protect those places or they just make us feel more grounded or more spiritual, like Bob Engelman said earlier. But think about all those people that don't care. Maybe they haven't had those moments in nature, and maybe they've gone to a place and it's already past the point of actually protection that was needed. So I just want to leave everybody with that sentiment. Kind of next time you go on a hike or next time you go on a bike ride, if one of your friends hasn't done that and you think they might be interested, bring them with you. Or next time somebody is closed off from talking about climate change, maybe consider that they just haven't had that exposure that you've had and haven't seen those places to either make them care or make them worry. So I think, there's that sentiment that William James, the philosopher, says, act as if what you do makes a difference. And I think all of you in the room have the power to do that, whether it's in your research at school, whether it's in your career that you choose after school, or even if it's on the weekends, in what you choose and how you choose to share those moments and get other people connected to those rivers or those places where they're actually going to care. Because, similar to when we hear people talk about far off places or you watch them on the Discovery Channel, it's exciting and it's intriguing, but it's really hard for it to resonate with you unless you've been there and you've met the people and you've seen it and you've smelled it and you've felt what you feel when you're there. So just a consideration.
And I actually think that's really great and very true. But I actually also came to environment kind of the opposite way. While I did grow up in a rural area, my aha moment was actually my family and I went to Santa Barbara in 1988. And there was an oil spill off the coast. And I remember walking on the beach and coming back with oil on my feet and going to the pier and seeing the birds clean up. And so sometimes it doesn't take blissful wilderness to get people to connect with the environment. Sometimes it's seeing the destruction we have wrought.
Excuse me. I just wanted to answer a little bit about your question. This week on C-SPAN, there was an announcement that Australia's tax was actually repealed, and it's rather incomprehensible that should be so, because it was very effective and it was making money and doing all the things that you mentioned. And yet it was repealed. And I haven't had a chance to look into why they did that. But unfortunately, it was received by some of the naysayers and some of the non-tax people, which unfortunately we have a lot of in our Congress, particularly the House. And so it just gave a lot of power to them to say, oh, let's not do it here. But it was working very effectively. So I just wanted to let that be known, that it was an effective program, it was working, but this week it was canceled.
More questions?
Yeah, I think we have one more.
So this is a question for Ms. Johnston. I was wondering if you believe if there are any ecosystems that are more critical than others, and if there are, what makes them more critical to the environment, and if not, then how, what components of an ecosystem make it critical?
It's a great question. I think, if I could rely on the experts, the methodology that's called biodiversity hotspots is really a great way to pinpoint what are really important hotspots around the world. That was developed about 15 years ago, no, maybe 20 years ago now, but that's looking at those pockets around the world where species rates are highest, most concentrated, and in these 40 areas around the world where there's also rapid rates of decline. And a lot of those are tropical areas around the world. Those are really important because those are the places where there's the most species and they're most in danger of being lost. I would also argue some of the most critical ecosystems out there are also cities. because cities are places where we have huge population densities around the world. All these people moving in, people working, people transport, or people getting to and from every day, people consuming, and those people are making decisions every day that affect rural places or affect the hotspots. We're also deciding in those cities, how do we develop? Are we sustainable in what we do? Do we have our green lens on every day when we're making policies, when we're putting up new buildings, when we're designing new places in the cities, when we're choosing what we can do? Are we going to ban plastics? Are we going to have certain restrictions on food and other ways that businesses operate? So I would argue that cities are really critical, but then also you have areas that are rural areas that are, it's really hard, I guess, to put a stamp on what are the most critical places, but you also have rural areas that are hotspots for natural resources. Like Ben was talking about Pennsylvania, where he's from. There's large pockets up there where there's fracking happening, just like many other places in the U.S. Those areas are rural, but they're being exploited because of what they've got underground. So I think it comes down to how you think about what you're doing when you're in each of those areas, and then what you're doing and decisions you're making as a consumer when you're not in those places. Are you choosing to travel to those places to see them or to conserve them? Are you choosing a certain type of energy that's maybe coming from a rural area that you don't want to be fracked? Are you choosing renewables? Are you choosing non-renewables? So hopefully that's helpful.
So I'd like to answer your question at the scale of the entire ecosystem of the planet. So this planet actually works as a linked physical and biological system. And you know, the composition of the atmosphere with the amount of oxygen we have is because of past biological activity early in the history of life on Earth. And some of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today is from the destruction of modern-day ecosystems, so deforestation and degraded grazing lands and grasslands, agricultural systems that leak carbon, destruction of coastal wetlands. And in that simple fact or set of facts is actually a very important positive hope, because as I mentioned, that 2-degree target, it's not only bad for sea level rise, it's really bad for biology. And if we were to do ecosystem restoration, we could get a lot of that CO2 back out of the atmosphere and avoid, I think, at least 0.6 of a degree Celsius of climate change, which would make it much better for the biology of the planet. And the wonderful thing about restoration is that you get other benefits. So with reforestation, you get the restoration of forest watersheds, for example. Restoration of grasslands and grazing lands, you get better grazing. Restoring carbon to soils, you get increased soil fertility. Restoring coastal wetlands, you get protection against storm surge. So in the end, it makes a lot of sense for us to think about doing something with those degraded parts of the planet which aren't providing much benefit in any form at all at the moment, and start managing the planet like the living system that it is.
Thanks. Yeah, I can't resist following up on that point, Tom. Could you imagine, the issue of the carbon tax was raised before, which is a negative tax on emitting carbon. Could you imagine some sort of climate regime that would commodify or incentivize biological sequestration of carbon so that, do we have the science so that there'd be some, I always sort of think about the possibility that we could organize our education around this problem and see how many other subjects that leads us to. Economics, biology, chemistry, all those things put together. Could we somehow monitor where carbon is actually going into soils and plants and find a way to notice or be aware of how much it's increasing, and then find an economic mechanism to reward farmers, to reward people who just want to go out and do biological restoration or pasture lands or things of that kind? Or is that kind of beyond what science is likely to be able to?
No, I actually think our remote sensing capabilities are pretty good for at least some parts of that. So forests and grasslands, I don't know so much about monitoring soil carbon, although I do know there is some possibility of doing that, and certainly with coastal wetlands. In fact, there are maps that you can get now of blue carbon potential. And Global Forest Watch at World Resources Institute has maps of reforestation potential. And so if one chose to sort of in some kind of system, either nationally or regionally or globally, to generate revenue through a carbon tax, it certainly could go into that.
So I will also comment on that. I know I'm not a panelist, but during my day job, I work for the Coalition on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. And we actually just had a meeting 2 weeks ago in Denver to talk about offset potential and protocol development for rangeland management and other agricultural practices that you can incentivize farmers to do by creating these voluntary or compliance level credits. So it's definitely happening. It's still very slow to develop, and one of the things that we were talking about is how do you get more multinational corporations involved in this to invest in these offsets and provide some upfront funding for the farmers and for other agricultural and just more land management practices in general to start to redevelop some of these habitats and just continue with progress on more sustainable practices for farming and rangelands. So there. One in the front.
Hey, my name is Christine Harris. I'm a student here at Mason, and this is a question for anyone up there. But obviously, out of all the greenhouse gases, carbon is the one that is most talked about. But out of the other ones, such as, from my understanding, methane is actually just as equally, if not more, severe of a problem. Is there a way that we can include that more into our day-to-day language when we're talking about climate change in relation to greenhouse gases? And do you think that that is a very severe one that we should be including just as much as carbon?
I'll take it. Thanks for the question. So actually, methane does get a lot of attention and has been getting a lot of attention for a number of years now. So methane makes up, I think, around 10%, maybe 10% or so of U.S. I might have the figure wrong. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions when you look at them on a CO2 equivalent basis. So actually, there are a number of things happening on methane, specifically domestically and internationally. So one is that EPA, for a long time now, has had a number of voluntary programs with different industries to reduce methane from landfills, from coal mines, from agriculture, and also to work with the petroleum industry to plug up leaks. A lot of times there are leaks in the multitude of pipelines and valves in petroleum systems, and sometimes those leaks go unnoticed. But there's technology now, kind of with infrared technology, that can actually detect leaks. And EPA has worked with industry to encourage the use of these technologies because it saves it saves the companies money. You don't want to be losing methane to the atmosphere because that's a resource as natural gas. So unlike some of the other pollutants, there can be a huge financial incentive to capture, avoid and capture methane emissions. And methane is also getting a good amount of attention internationally, where we're actually partnering with other countries to kind of export these practices that have been successful in the U.S. because there are large methane sources in Russia, in China, for example, coal mines. And increasingly, people have been talking about methane and other greenhouse gases that are, on a pound-for-pound basis, they're more potent than CO2 in terms of their climate effect, but they're shorter-lived in the atmosphere. That means when you reduce the emissions, the benefit that you see in the climate actually occurs sooner than is the case with CO2. And as a result, people have increasingly been talking about methane as a, quote, kind of near-term climate strategy. And in the Arctic, for example, which is where I've been doing a lot of work with other Arctic countries, there's been a lot of focus on methane there, and actually black carbon, which is not a greenhouse gas, but which is a component of particulate matter, and it falls on the snow and ice and darkens it. And because of the very high rates of warming, people have been talking about specifically going after methane and black carbon as a way to reduce near-term rates of climate change over the next couple of decades, but recognizing that absolutely you have to focus on CO2 for the bigger and long-term problem.
So the other day, I was at Barnes & Noble's in the nature section for a biology book, and I found a book by a man named Brian Sussman called Eco-Tyranny, How the Left-Green Agenda is Dismantling America. And I decided to go on Amazon.com and see the reviews for the book, expecting to find, this is ridiculous reviews all over the place. And I didn't find a single negative review of the book. So obviously, I provided the negative review. It's pretty lengthy, a couple paragraphs. But every day we see this, like primarily Fox, obviously, you're seeing people given airtime who deny climate change, just in barely any to the people who are actually educated and understand science. But the problem is, like, the way our legal system works is you cannot pronounce, like, you have intent to hurt another person, cause bodily harm, like that's an illegal offense. But to cause harm to the environment is completely fine. So the question is it just supposed to be our educated free speech against the uneducated free speech in America that determines who's allowed to go out and sing whatever they want? Or will there ever be a time where we can actually start taking action, like legally, to say you cannot go around spreading misinformation? Sorry. I know it's a big question.
Thank you for the question on this Saturday morning. Well, first, I mean, like I said before, there's no doubt that these issues have become political and hot button, and I think it is going to take a lot of time and effort and patience to break through. I don't think, for those of us concerned about this issue, I don't think our realistic job is to convince every single person that, to view things the way you view them. There are always going to be people who disagree with you and who see issues differently. And unfortunately, sometimes it's just perception, and sometimes when messages get repeated, even if they're not factual, people start to believe them. And so I would also, encourage people to think when there are people who disagree or who are commenting like this, to not to view them as, not to automatically view them as uneducated or dumb, because sometimes there are actually very very smart, educated people who just see these problems completely differently, and and sometimes I think that's rooted in the fact that these issues have become kind of political hot button issues. So in that case, people might immediately go to the arguments that other people who are more politically aligned with them make, and sometimes they will do a good job of arguing for themselves that that you are wrong or someone else is wrong. So I would just say that it takes patience and it takes patience and perseverance, and trying to find some middle ground and venues, ways of talking about these issues that try to break through some of the political divide. I mean, I face this on my job, and in comments that come into to EPA, and we have to rebut them with a lot of kind of diligence and patience and civility as well. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but.
So my experience is that there's some people who don't even want to listen, right? And I don't spend a lot of time trying to deal with those kinds of people. But then there, just over the weekend, there was somebody at a social event I was at where you wouldn't have expected the question about climate change that I got. But she actually listened, and the additional thing I would say is, as young people, your voices are actually much more powerful than you might realize, because nobody really wants to look bad or dumb in front of young people. And the story I like to tell is Paul Wolfowitz, who was Secretary of Defense and was president of the World Bank for a bit, was a non-believer in climate change until his son came back from Stanford for Thanksgiving and had been taking climate change with Stephen Schneider and convinced his father over the Thanksgiving table that it was real. So I guess the important message is never give up.
I wasn't going to mention this, but I think that dovetails really nicely. The group I work for at Conservation International, for years, Wolfowitz was the chair of our donor board. When he was at the World Bank, the 6 other donors that contributed to the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund each had a representative, and Wolfowitz sat on that, and now he invites members of our staff and our donor group to come out every year because he's so committed to biodiversity conservation. And it's a shift in one person, but it's a shift in one very powerful person. But another thing I wanted to mention is some research I did for my master's thesis on young people is very, very promising, especially in the U.S. If you look at statistics for college students and where they're choosing to go, more and more young people are choosing to go to universities where there are green cultures, or there are majors, whether it's engineering, whether it's environmental science, anything focuses on the environment. There are more young MBA students coming out that are leading companies where they have that core, or they have that green consciousness at their core. And so the catch-22 is it's going to be years before younger people are leading more of these organizations and are elected officials. But at the same time, I don't think we should forget the fact that more and more young people are probably not reading so much of the radical stuff, and they're on the bandwagon. They care. Everybody in here grew up knowing what a recycle bin was. That was a different thing for the baby boom generation. That was introduced later on. They were the ones that started and pioneered Earth Day, that got us thinking about that and raising their children to be conscious. But this generation is moving at a speed at an unprecedented rate, and I think more people are concerned, and more people, even if they go into industries like energy and mining, they probably have more of a conscience than 10 years ago, just because they've learned the information. You can't unlearn it.
And I also think another thing to think about is just you never know when an opportunity may be to change someone's mind a little bit. I remember when I was getting ready to come out to grad school, I was invited to this dinner, and it had assigned seating. And I was sat at a table with the president of one of the largest roofing companies, commercial roofing companies in southern Wisconsin. And he was being polite and asking me what I was doing. And I said, well, I was getting ready to go to grad school at American University to study global environmental policy. And he started asking a lot of questions. We clearly didn't agree on a lot of things. But, he really listened to me and really took in what I was saying. And about 2 years later, they started green roofing, producing green roofing. So, I don't know that I changed his mind, but he did listen. So, take advantage of every opportunity you have. You never know who's listening.
Well, I think
so a few years ago, I was at 4 years ago, I was sitting at a dinner in New York where most of us didn't know each other, and so we were telling each other who we were and what we did. And I sitting next to this hedge fund guy, and I tell him about biodiversity and stuff, and he says, well, that's nice, but in the age of the internet and this, that, and the other thing, why does that matter? And I just said, you can't eat the internet.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So if everyone could help me and give the panelists a big round of applause. Thank you all. Those were some pretty tough questions. So I'm going to invite Martha up, I think, for the next portion. But obviously, if you have unanswered questions, I think some or most of them will be around for a little bit longer. So feel free to go up to them and ask.
Thank you, panelists. You did a great